In November 1918, the guns fell silent across the Western Front. Germany, exhausted and blockaded, stood on the brink of collapse. Soldiers returned from the trenches not in triumph, but in confusion. The empire had fallen. The Kaiser had abdicated. Revolution flickered through the streets of Berlin and Munich. What had once been imperial certainty dissolved into political chaos. In the vacuum left behind, anger and humiliation began to take root. The Treaty of Versailles formalized defeat in 1919. Territorial losses reduced Germany's borders. Its army was restricted. Its colonies were stripped away. Heavy reparations were imposed, placing immense strain on an already fragile economy. Many Germans did not see the treaty as a negotiated settlement, but as a dictated punishment. The phrase Diktat von Versailles circulated widely. For veterans and civilians alike, the war's end felt less like peace and more like imposed submission. Economic hardship deepened resentment. Inflation spiraled in the early 1920s. Savings evaporated. Middle-class families who had once lived in stability found themselves impoverished almost overnight. Political violence became common in the streets. Radical movements emerged on both the left and the right, each promising restoration, order, and national revival. The fragile Weimar Republic struggled to assert authority amid competing factions and paramilitary groups. It was in this atmosphere of instability that extremist rhetoric found fertile ground. Narratives of betrayal, conspiracy, and lost greatness spread rapidly. Some argued that Germany had not been defeated militarily, but undermined from within. This stab-in-the-back myth would become a powerful political weapon, shaping public perception and fueling nationalist anger. In Munich, among veterans and political agitators, small nationalist groups gathered in beer halls to debate the nation's future. Their meetings were often chaotic, their ideas fragmented. Yet beneath the disorder was a shared conviction: Germany must be restored to strength. From these circles, a figure would emerge who combined theatrical oratory with ideological absolutism. His voice would channel frustration into a vision of radical transformation. The story of Adolf Hitler does not begin in triumph or in the halls of power. It begins in the shadows of defeat, in a nation disoriented by war, wounded by treaty, and searching for direction. The rise of a dictator was not inevitable, but it was made possible by the convergence of humiliation, economic crisis, and political fragmentation. In the aftermath of 1918, Germany stood at a crossroads. Democracy struggled to survive. Extremism gathered momentum. The forces that would reshape Europe were forming quietly amid uncertainty. The collapse of one world had opened the door to another. And within that opening, the foundations of a darker chapter were being laid. In the turbulent years following the First World War, Munich became a crucible of radical politics. Veterans gathered in cramped halls and smoke-filled beer cellars, debating the fate of a wounded nation. Among the many small nationalist groups that emerged was the German Workers' Party, an obscure organization with limited influence and fragmented ideas. It was into this setting that Adolf Hitler first stepped in 1919, initially sent as an army informant to observe political activity. What he discovered was not a disciplined movement, but an opportunity. The party lacked structure, coherence, and direction. Yet it possessed something valuable: a platform. Hitler quickly realized that his ability to speak, to project certainty amid chaos, gave him influence. His speeches were not measured analyses. They were emotionally charged performances. He spoke of betrayal, of national humiliation, of enemies within and without. His language was simple, forceful, and repetitive. It resonated with audiences searching for explanation and purpose. Within a short time, Hitler transformed from observer to participant. He joined the party and began reshaping it. The organization was renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP. A new flag was introduced. Meetings grew larger. Propaganda became more systematic. The movement adopted paramilitary elements to protect gatherings and project strength in the streets. Politics in Weimar Germany was often physical as well as rhetorical, and control of space mattered. Hitler's leadership style was absolute. He demanded loyalty and centralized authority. Rivals were sidelined. Internal debates narrowed. The party's message became increasingly radical, combining extreme nationalism, racial ideology, and promises of national revival. Economic frustration and political instability provided fertile ground. While many dismissed the party as fringe, its membership steadily expanded. The turning point came in 1923 with the failed beer hall putsch, an attempted coup in Munich. Inspired in part by events in Italy, Hitler and his supporters sought to seize power by force. The attempt collapsed quickly. Shots were fired. Leaders were arrested. The rebellion failed. Yet the consequences were paradoxical. During his trial, Hitler used the courtroom as a stage. He presented himself as a patriot driven by conviction. Media coverage amplified his message beyond Bavaria. Sentenced to prison, he used his confinement not as retreat, but as recalibration. In Landsberg prison, he dictated ideas that would later be published as Mein Kampf, outlining his ideological framework and long-term ambitions. More importantly, he concluded that power in Germany would not be seized through sudden uprising, but through legal political maneuvering. When he emerged from prison in 1924, he faced a changed political landscape. The economy had stabilized temporarily. Radical momentum had slowed. Yet he had gained something crucial: national recognition. The obscure agitator had become a known political figure. His path forward would no longer rely on immediate revolution, but on disciplined organization and calculated strategy. The early 1920s were a testing ground. Failure did not end the movement. It refined it. Hitler learned from defeat and prepared for a different route to power. By the end of the 1920s, the fragile stability of the Weimar Republic began to fracture once more. What had appeared to be a period of recovery was exposed as deeply dependent on international loans and economic cooperation. When the global financial system faltered in 1929, Germany felt the shock with particular force. Factories slowed production. Banks collapsed. Unemployment surged into the millions. The streets once again filled with uncertainty. For many citizens, the economic collapse felt like a confirmation of systemic failure. Parliamentary governments rose and fell in rapid succession, unable to form lasting coalitions. Emergency decrees increasingly replaced normal legislative processes. Confidence in democratic institutions eroded. Political discourse grew sharper, more polarized. Extremist parties on both ends of the spectrum expanded their support. The National Socialist movement, which had struggled to regain momentum after the failed putsch, found new traction in this environment. Its message shifted strategically. While ideological foundations remained intact, public emphasis turned toward economic revival, job creation, and national unity. Campaigns were organized with unprecedented coordination. Posters, rallies, and speeches were carefully staged. The party presented itself as disciplined and dynamic, in contrast to what it portrayed as parliamentary paralysis. Hitler's speeches evolved as well. He tailored his rhetoric to different audiences: workers, farmers, industrialists, veterans. He promised restoration of national pride, economic renewal, and decisive leadership. The tone combined grievance with assurance. The promise was simple: order would replace chaos, strength would replace weakness. Electoral gains followed. In the 1930 Reichstag elections, the National Socialists made significant advances. 2 years later, they became the largest party in parliament. Yet they did not command an outright majority. Germany remained divided, and political maneuvering intensified behind the scenes. Conservative elites, seeking stability and fearing leftist revolution, underestimated the ambitions of the radical movement they considered using for their own ends. The crisis of the early 1930s did not automatically produce dictatorship. It produced fragmentation, fear, and opportunity. Power was not seized in a single dramatic act. It was negotiated through a series of miscalculations, alliances, and political compromises. The structures of democracy weakened incrementally. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. To some observers, it appeared to be a tactical inclusion within a broader, conservative government. Few anticipated how rapidly the balance of authority would shift. What began as an appointment within constitutional bounds would soon transform into a systematic consolidation of power. Economic collapse had opened a door. Political instability had widened it. The next stage would determine whether Germany's democratic experiment would survive or be dismantled from within. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor on 30 January 1933, the decision was framed as a political compromise. Conservative leaders believed they could contain him within a cabinet structure they controlled. They underestimated both his determination and the discipline of the movement behind him. Within weeks, Germany's fragile democracy would begin to unravel. The turning point came with the Reichstag fire in February 1933. The blaze that consumed the parliamentary building created an atmosphere of fear and urgency. Whether orchestrated or exploited, the event provided justification for emergency measures. Civil liberties were suspended. Freedom of speech, press, and assembly were curtailed. Political opponents, particularly communists, were arrested in large numbers. The legal framework of the Republic began to shift under extraordinary decrees. The March 1933 elections took place in an environment shaped by intimidation and propaganda. Although the National Socialists did not secure an absolute majority, they leveraged alliances and political pressure to pass the enabling act. This legislation transferred legislative authority from Parliament to the Cabinet, effectively granting Hitler the power to rule by decree. The law was passed within constitutional procedure, yet it hollowed out the Constitution itself. What followed was not immediate chaos, but systematic consolidation. Political parties were dissolved or banned. Trade unions were replaced by state-controlled organizations. Regional governments were subordinated to central authority. The judiciary and civil service were reshaped to align with the new order. Each measure appeared administrative, yet collectively they transformed the structure of governance. Public life changed rapidly. Propaganda expanded across newspapers, radio broadcasts, and public events. Mass rallies projected unity and strength. Symbols and rituals reinforced loyalty. Dissent grew increasingly dangerous. The regime sought not only political obedience but ideological conformity. education, culture, and youth organizations were gradually integrated into the state's vision. The death of President Paul von Hindenburg in 1934 removed the final constitutional counterbalance. The offices of Chancellor and President were merged. A plebiscite formalized the change. The armed forces swore an oath of loyalty not to the state, but to Hitler personally. The title Führer signified the culmination of power centralized in a single individual. The transformation from republic to dictatorship did not occur overnight, nor solely through violence. It unfolded through legal mechanisms, administrative restructuring, propaganda, and calculated coercion. Institutions were repurposed, opposition was neutralized, authority became concentrated. By the end of 1934, the democratic framework of Germany had been dismantled. What had begun as political appointment had evolved into total control. The seizure of power was complete, not through dramatic revolution, but through incremental domination of the state itself. By 1934, political opposition had been systematically neutralized, but consolidation required more than legal authority. It required control over institutions, loyalty within the ranks, and the elimination of potential rivals. The dictatorship now entered a decisive internal phase, one that would define the structure of the regime for years to come. Within the movement itself, tensions had emerged. Paramilitary formations, particularly those that had helped propel the party to prominence, expected continued influence. Some leaders advocated for a second revolution, sweeping social and economic transformation beyond political control. This prospect alarmed conservative elites and the military establishment, whose support remained essential for stability. In June 1934, the regime acted swiftly. A coordinated purge targeted perceived rivals within its own ranks, as well as external opponents. Arrests and executions were carried out with calculated precision. The operation was presented as a necessary defense of national order. Official statements framed it as the prevention of treason. In reality, it removed competing centers of influence and reinforced centralized authority. The aftermath solidified loyalty within the armed forces. Military leaders reassured that radical paramilitary ambitions had been curtailed, pledged allegiance. The regime positioned itself as the guardian of stability and national revival. Control tightened over police forces, intelligence services, and internal security structures. Surveillance expanded. Fear became a silent instrument of governance. Simultaneously, the state intensified its effort to reshape society. Cultural institutions were reorganized. Independent artistic expression was restricted. Media outlets were consolidated under centralized messaging. Education systems were redesigned to align with ideological priorities. Youth organizations expanded, cultivating generational loyalty. Public life increasingly reflected uniformity. Economic policy also played a role in consolidation. Large infrastructure projects, including highway construction and industrial expansion, reduced unemployment and projected momentum. Rearmament programs stimulated production. Though resource-intensive, these initiatives created visible signs of revival. Many citizens experienced improved economic conditions compared to the early 1930s, reinforcing perceptions of restored stability. Internationally, the regime tested boundaries cautiously. Diplomatic gestures alternated with bold moves designed to probe foreign reactions. Military restrictions imposed by earlier treaties were quietly challenged. Each success without decisive opposition strengthened confidence. Consolidation was not simply repression, It was orchestration, aligning political, military, economic, and cultural systems under unified command. Authority radiated outward from a central figure whose image was carefully cultivated. Loyalty was framed as patriotism. Conformity was presented as unity. By the mid-1930s, Germany had been transformed from a divided republic into a centralized, authoritarian state. The internal struggle for control had ended decisively. What remained was the outward projection of ambition, a regime confident in its dominance and increasingly willing to test the limits of European order. By the mid-1930s, consolidation at home was accompanied by a gradual transformation of Germany's military posture. The restrictions imposed after the First World War had limited the size of the army, prohibited certain weapons, and placed oversight on industrial production. These constraints were now increasingly treated as temporary obstacles rather than permanent realities. Rearmament moved from covert preparation to visible policy. Military expansion was framed publicly as a restoration of national dignity and security. Compulsory service was reintroduced in 1935, directly violating treaty limitations. New divisions were organized. Aircraft production accelerated. Shipyards revived. The modernization of the armed forces became both strategic priority and symbol of regained sovereignty. Factories expanded output under state coordination, blending economic recovery with military ambition. The reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936 marked a calculated gamble. German troops entered the demilitarized zone along the western border, territory whose status had been defined by post-war agreements. The move was risky. Military commanders reportedly received instructions to withdraw if confronted decisively. Yet no major intervention followed. The absence of immediate opposition reinforced confidence within the regime. Each successful step strengthened the perception that bold action would be tolerated. Rearmament projects intensified. Technological development advanced rapidly in aviation, armor, and communications. Military exercises grew larger and more coordinated. Propaganda highlighted images of discipline, order, and national resurgence. The armed forces became central to the regime's narrative of revival. Foreign policy simultaneously grew more assertive. Diplomatic alignments shifted. Agreements were formed with like-minded governments. Strategic positioning in Europe began to change. While official statements often emphasized peaceful intentions, military preparation suggested readiness for expansion. The boundary between deterrence and ambition blurred. Rearmament was not solely military policy, it was psychological strategy. It projected strength domestically and internationally. It cultivated unity around shared purpose. It also narrowed the path back to restraint. As resources were increasingly directed toward defense industries, economic planning intertwined with strategic calculation. By the late 1930s, Germany had emerged as a formidable military power once again. The constraints of the previous decade had eroded. Confidence, bolstered by a series of unchallenged moves, deepened. Europe watched uneasily as the balance of power shifted. Rearmament and defiance marked a transition. The regime had stabilized internally and tested international limits. The next phase would determine whether ambition remained contained within revision of treaties or moved toward open confrontation. By 1938, the regime's strategy had entered a new phase. Expansion achieved not through immediate large-scale war, but through calculated pressure, diplomacy, and the manipulation of crises. The first major step came with the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria. Political instability within Austria, combined with external pressure and internal agitation, created conditions for intervention. German forces crossed the border with minimal resistance. The event was presented as reunification, a fulfillment of national unity. The international response was limited. Formal protests were issued, but no decisive action followed. Once again, bold movement met hesitation rather than confrontation. The regime interpreted this as confirmation that strategic risk-taking would be tolerated. Momentum increased. Attention then shifted to Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, a region with a significant ethnic German population. Claims of discrimination and instability were amplified. Diplomatic negotiations intensified. European leaders, still deeply influenced by memories of the First World War, sought to avoid another catastrophic conflict. The Munich Agreement of September 1938 transferred the Sudetenland to Germany without Czechoslovakia's participation in the final decision. At the time, the agreement was described by some as a triumph of peace. Yet it revealed something deeper: collective reluctance to confront expansion early. Within months, the remainder of Czechoslovakia was occupied, demonstrating that territorial ambition extended beyond ethnic claims. The pattern was clear: incremental moves, framed as limited objectives, followed by broader consolidation. Domestically, each territorial gain reinforced the image of decisive leadership. Crowds gathered. Speeches proclaimed restored greatness. The regime's popularity grew as borders expanded without immediate war. The narrative emphasized correction of historical injustice rather than aggression. Yet beneath the surface, strategic calculations were accelerating. Military preparations continued. Industrial output increased. Diplomatic relationships were reshaped to secure tactical advantage. The European balance of power was shifting rapidly, and trust between states eroded. Expansion without war proved effective, but only temporarily. Each concession encouraged further ambition. The precedent had been established: pressure, demand, negotiation, gain. The system of European security, already fragile, began to fracture. By the close of 1938, the path toward broader conflict had narrowed significantly. What had begun as revision of post-war arrangements now pointed toward confrontation. The question was no longer whether the expansion would continue, but how far it would go before resistance became unavoidable. By early 1939, the pattern of expansion had reached its limit. The occupation of the remainder of Czechoslovakia signaled a decisive shift. Previous actions had been framed as reunification or protection of ethnic populations. This move, however, revealed broader territorial ambition. European leaders who had hoped to preserve peace through negotiation began to reassess their assumptions. Attention now turned eastward. The city of Danzig and the Polish corridor became focal points of escalating demands. Diplomatic pressure intensified. Public rhetoric hardened. Military planning accelerated behind closed doors. The strategy that had relied on incremental gains without immediate war now faced the prospect of open conflict. At the same time, a significant diplomatic maneuver altered the strategic landscape. In August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. Publicly, it pledged neutrality between the two powers. Privately, it contained secret protocols dividing spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. The agreement stunned observers and removed the immediate risk of a two-front war, a calculation rooted in the lessons of the First World War. With diplomatic conditions secured, military preparations moved into final stages. Troop concentrations increased near the Polish border. Logistics networks were mobilized. Strategic timing was carefully considered. The regime calculated that swift action could achieve objectives before foreign powers fully mobilized. On September 1st, 1939, German forces crossed into Poland. The invasion combined mechanized units, coordinated air operations, and rapid maneuver, tactics designed to overwhelm defensive positions quickly. The strategy aimed to achieve decisive results before extended resistance could form. Britain and France, bound by guarantees to Poland, declared war days later. What had been a regional crisis transformed into a continental conflict. The strategy of expansion without general war had ended. Europe was once again at war. The road to conflict had been paved by miscalculation, ambition, and delayed response. Diplomatic concessions had bought time, but not stability. The shift from pressure to invasion marked a turning point not only for Germany, but for the entire world. The era of maneuver and negotiation was over. The next chapter would unfold on battlefields stretching across continents. The invasion of Poland marked the opening phase of a new kind of warfare. Coordinated assaults combined armored divisions, mobile infantry, and close air support into rapid, concentrated strikes designed to disorient and overwhelm. Speed became the defining element. Defensive lines were bypassed, communications were disrupted. The objective was not gradual attrition, but swift collapse. Poland fell within weeks. The campaign demonstrated the effectiveness of mechanized coordination and reinforced confidence within German command structures. Yet the broader conflict had only begun. Britain and France had declared war, but immediate large-scale fighting in the West did not follow. The winter of 1939 to 1940 became a tense pause, a period sometimes described as a phony war. Behind the quiet front lines, preparation intensified. In April 1940, operations expanded northward. Denmark and Norway were targeted to secure strategic access and supply routes. Control of the Norwegian coastline was particularly significant, influencing naval positioning and resource flows. These operations further demonstrated coordinated planning and operational speed. The decisive test came in May 1940. German forces advanced through the Low Countries and into France. Instead of repeating the static trench warfare of the previous generation, armored units maneuvered through terrain considered difficult for large formations. The breakthrough at Sedan shattered assumptions about defensive security. Allied forces, surprised by the pace and direction of attack, struggled to reorganize. The rapid advance created encirclements and forced retreats. One of the most dramatic moments occurred at Dunkirk, where Allied forces were evacuated across the Channel under intense pressure. Though many soldiers escaped, France's strategic position deteriorated rapidly. By June 1940, Paris had fallen. France signed an armistice shortly thereafter. These early victories reshaped Europe. Within months, much of Western Europe had come under German control or influence. The speed of success reinforced perceptions of military superiority and strategic foresight. Confidence within the regime soared. Yet beneath the triumph lay overextension. Rapid expansion increased logistical demands. Occupied territories required administration and security. Strategic decisions loomed regarding future direction, whether to consolidate gains or pursue further confrontation. The early phase of the war demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated mobility. It also set expectations of continued momentum. Victory appeared swift and decisive. But the conflict was far from resolved. New fronts would open. New adversaries would emerge. The pattern of rapid conquest had redefined European power and set the stage for an even broader and more devastating struggle. With France defeated in the summer of 1940, Western Europe lay largely under German control. Only Britain remained openly defiant. The question confronting Berlin was whether the island nation could be forced into negotiation or compelled into submission. Plans for a potential invasion were drafted, but such an operation required control of the skies and protection of sea lanes. The struggle shifted upward. The air campaign that followed was unlike previous operations. Instead of supporting advancing ground forces, the Luftwaffe now sought to break British resistance through sustained aerial pressure. Airfields, radar installations, industrial facilities, and ports became primary targets. Fighter Command's infrastructure was placed under relentless strain. The campaign revealed the importance of integrated defense systems. Radar provided early warning. Fighter squadrons were directed with increasing precision. Aircraft production accelerated despite bombardment. The sky above southern England became a daily battleground of interception and counter-interception. German bombers, effective in earlier continental campaigns, now faced coordinated opposition. Fighter escorts had limited range over British territory. Losses mounted. Strategic assumptions were tested. The expectation that concentrated air power alone could force rapid capitulation proved overly optimistic. As the campaign evolved, bombing increasingly targeted urban centers. Civilian areas endured repeated night raids. Yet morale did not collapse as anticipated. Industrial output continued. Defensive adaptation improved coordination between radar, fighters, and ground control. The failure to secure air superiority altered strategic calculations. Plans for invasion were postponed indefinitely. The conflict entered a new phase, one in which Germany faced a prolonged war against a determined opponent, supported by maritime access and growing international backing. The Battle of Britain marked a critical turning point. It demonstrated that rapid conquest had limits. Technological capability alone did not guarantee decisive results. Integrated defense, industrial resilience, and strategic endurance proved decisive factors. For the first time since the war began, expansion met sustained resistance that could not be quickly overcome. Momentum slowed. The conflict widened. The limits of power had been exposed, and the next decision would expand the war even further. In June 1941, the conflict expanded beyond its previous boundaries in a single sweeping decision. Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in history up to that time, involving millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and extensive air support. The campaign was conceived as a rapid, decisive strike intended to defeat the Soviet state before winter. The opening phase mirrored earlier successes. Armored spearheads advanced deep into Soviet territory. Large encirclements captured vast numbers of prisoners. Airfields were overrun. Communications collapsed in many sectors. The scale of the assault shocked observers. Within weeks, German forces had penetrated hundreds of miles. Yet the Soviet Union presented a different challenge. Its geographic depth was immense. Industrial facilities were relocated eastward beyond the reach of immediate attack. Mobilization drew upon vast reserves of manpower. What had appeared to be another campaign of swift maneuver gradually transformed into a war of endurance. As summer gave way to autumn, supply lines stretched. Roads deteriorated. Logistics struggled to keep pace with rapid advances. The approach toward Moscow intensified expectations of decisive victory, yet resistance hardened. The onset of winter introduced severe conditions for which preparation had been insufficient. The campaign marked a fundamental shift in the war's trajectory. What had been a series of rapid conquests now became a prolonged struggle across enormous distances. Casualties mounted on both sides. The assumption of quick collapse proved mistaken. Operation Barbarossa opened a new front that demanded sustained commitment of resources. It also intensified the ideological dimension of the conflict, deepening brutality and hardening resolve. The Eastern Front would become the central theater of the European war. The decision to invade the Soviet Union altered strategic balance irrevocably. It expanded the scale of conflict beyond previous limits. It also committed Germany to a war on multiple fronts, a scenario long considered dangerous. Momentum that had seemed unstoppable in 1940 now encountered vast resistance. The war had entered a phase defined not by swift victory, but by attrition, scale, and endurance. By the end of 1941, the conflict had expanded beyond the European continent into a truly global war. The invasion of the Soviet Union had already stretched German forces across vast front lines. Yet another decisive shift occurred in December when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States formally into the war. Within days, Germany declared war on the United States, transforming a continental struggle into a worldwide confrontation. The entry of America altered strategic calculations profoundly. The United States possessed enormous industrial capacity, geographic security, and access to global supply routes. What had begun as European expansion now faced a coalition with unprecedented production potential. Factories across the Atlantic accelerated aircraft, ship, and vehicle manufacturing at extraordinary rates. Economic mobilization became a defining feature of the conflict. For Germany, this meant confronting a growing alliance of Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. Resources had to be divided across multiple fronts: Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean, North Africa, and increasingly contested airspace over Germany itself. Strategic planning grew more complex. The expectation of limited regional war gave way to the reality of sustained global engagement. On the battlefield, 1942 brought mixed fortunes. Initial advances in the Soviet Union continued, yet resistance stiffened. The campaign toward the Caucasus sought control of oil resources critical for mechanized warfare. In North Africa, forces maneuvered across desert terrain in a struggle for strategic positioning. Naval engagements intensified in the Atlantic as supply lines became targets. The air war also escalated. Bombing campaigns expanded in scale and frequency. Industrial centers were targeted. Defensive systems adapted. Technological competition accelerated. The war was no longer defined solely by territorial conquest. It became a contest of endurance between industrial systems. The declaration of war against the United States reflected confidence, but it also widened the scope of opposition dramatically. The coalition now arrayed against Germany possessed greater long-term production capacity. The strategic advantage that had characterized early campaigns began to erode. By 1942, the conflict had become a global war of attrition. Victory would no longer hinge on rapid breakthroughs alone. It would depend on sustained resources, coordination, and resilience across continents. The war had expanded beyond Europe's borders, and the balance of power was beginning to shift. By late 1942, the war's momentum had begun to shift. What had once seemed a series of unstoppable advances now encountered determined resistance and mounting logistical strain. Nowhere was this transformation more evident than in the city of Stalingrad. Situated along the Volga River, it became the focal point of one of the most consequential battles of the war. German forces had advanced deep into southern Soviet territory, aiming to secure oil fields vital for sustaining mechanized operations. The push toward Stalingrad was both strategic and symbolic. Capturing the city would sever key transport routes and deliver a psychological blow. Yet the battle quickly evolved into a brutal contest of endurance fought block by block. Urban warfare erased many advantages of mobility. Armored formations struggled in narrow streets and rubble-filled districts. Supply lines stretched thin. Soviet forces, reinforced and reorganized, launched counteroffensives designed to encircle advancing units. By November 1942, German troops within the city found themselves surrounded. The encirclement marked a decisive reversal. Attempts to resupply by air proved insufficient. Relief efforts failed to break through. As winter intensified, conditions deteriorated rapidly. In February 1943, remaining German forces in Stalingrad surrendered. The defeat was not merely tactical, it was strategic and psychological. The consequences rippled outward. On the Eastern Front, the initiative shifted gradually to Soviet forces. Industrial relocation east of the Ural Mountains had preserved production capacity. Fresh divisions entered the field. The scale of Soviet mobilization began to outweigh earlier German advantages. Elsewhere, the tide also began to turn. In North Africa, Axis forces faced mounting pressure. In the Atlantic, improved convoy protection reduced shipping losses. The cumulative effect of sustained bombing campaigns strained industrial capacity. The image of inevitability that had characterized early victories began to fade. Stalingrad didn't end the war, but it marked a threshold. It exposed the limits of expansion and the dangers of overextension. The conflict transitioned from rapid conquest to prolonged retreat. Strategic decline unfolded gradually rather than suddenly. Yet after Stalingrad, the trajectory was clear. The war had entered a phase in which recovery would be increasingly difficult. The balance of power, once tilted decisively, was shifting in the opposite direction. By 1944, the strategic landscape had changed irrevocably. The Eastern Front pressed steadily westward. Allied forces prepared for a return to continental Europe. Air superiority increasingly shifted away from Germany. The war that had begun with rapid expansion now contracted under sustained pressure from multiple directions. In June 1944, Allied troops landed in Normandy. The opening of a Western front fulfilled long-standing plans for coordinated assault. Beachheads were established despite fierce resistance. From there, a gradual breakout followed. Supply networks expanded across liberated territory. The conflict returned to the ground in Western Europe at a scale not seen since 1940. Simultaneously, Soviet advances accelerated. Major offensives pushed German forces back across vast territories previously captured. Industrial centers fell. Defensive lines shortened, but grew increasingly fragile. The cumulative strain of prolonged war, casualties, resource shortages, fuel deficits weakened operational capacity. Within Germany itself, bombing campaigns intensified. Transportation networks were disrupted. Oil production declined sharply. Industrial output faltered under repeated attack. Civil defense systems struggled to maintain stability. The material foundation that had sustained earlier campaigns eroded rapidly. Political tensions within the regime also surfaced. In July 1944, a failed assassination attempt underscored internal fractures. Though the leadership retained control, suspicion deepened, repression intensified. Yet, strategic realities could not be reversed by decree. By early 1945, Allied forces approached from both east and west. Cities were reduced to ruins. Refugee columns moved along damaged roads. Communications fractured. The war's final phase unfolded amid accelerating collapse. In April 1945, Soviet troops entered Berlin. Fighting in the capital was intense but brief. The regime that had promised renewal and expansion now confronted inevitable defeat. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler died in Berlin as the city fell. Days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The collapse was swift in its final moments, but long in preparation. Years of overreach, attrition, and coordinated opposition had converged. The structure of power built through consolidation and expansion unraveled under sustained pressure. The conflict in Europe ended in May 1945. What had begun as a movement rooted in grievance had culminated in devastation across continents. The regime's fall closed one of the most destructive chapters in modern history. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the devastation was not confined to ruined cities or shattered armies. It extended into political systems, moral frameworks, and the global balance of power. The dictatorship that had risen from economic crisis and nationalist resentment had left behind a continent scarred by destruction and loss. The consequences would shape international relations for generations. In the immediate aftermath, occupation zones divided Germany. Allied powers undertook the complex task of dismantling the regime's structures and confronting its crimes. Political organizations were dissolved. Symbols were removed. Institutions were reorganized. The process of denazification sought to separate society from the ideology that had guided it for more than a decade. International tribunals established new precedents. The Nuremberg trials held leading officials accountable for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. For the first time, the concept of individual responsibility at the highest levels of state authority was tested in a global forum. The legal language forged in these proceedings would influence international law in the decades that followed. Germany itself faced division. Economic reconstruction required external assistance. Political identity had to be rebuilt. The Cold War soon introduced a new geopolitical structure in which former allies became adversaries. The legacy of the dictatorship became intertwined with broader tensions between East and West. Beyond Germany, the war's end accelerated decolonization movements and reshaped global alliances. Institutions such as the United Nations were established in hopes of preventing future catastrophe. Military doctrine evolved, influenced by lessons learned about mechanization, air power, and industrial mobilization. The rise and fall of Adolf Hitler demonstrated how political systems can erode from within under economic stress and ideological polarization. It also illustrated how authoritarian power can expand rapidly when institutions are weakened and opposition fragmented. Yet the eventual collapse revealed the limits of aggression sustained against coordinated resistance. The legacy of the deadliest conflict in European history is complex. It is a story of ambition and destruction, but also of accountability and reconstruction. It reminds future generations that stability cannot be taken for granted and that the defense of democratic institutions requires vigilance. When the engines stopped and the guns fell silent, Europe faced not only physical rebuilding, but moral reckoning. The era had ended, but its lessons remained.